Hi everyone, this is Heather. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be making 3 different cards with the same stamp set. I got this really pretty floral set from Recollections at Michael's. This is their in-house brand and it has lots of really wonderful sayings and different flowers, and I thought it would be a really great stamp set to use some different techniques on. We're going to be using some embossing and colored pencils, alcohol-based markers and ink blending, and an ink smooshing technique. Before we get started, I did want to talk a little bit about what this stamp set is made of. This is actually silicone and not photopolymer. So it reacts a little bit differently to stamping and inking than maybe some of the other sets that you use. One of the nice things is that they are less expensive than photopolymer stamps, but you do need to be a little bit more diligent when you're stamping with them. My biggest suggestion when you're working with silicone stamps is to use a stamp positioner, because a lot of times you might not get a good clean inking. So using a stamp positioner where you could stamp multiple times really fixes all those problems. The first card that we're going to be making is colored in with colored pencils, and the stamping is done with gold heat embossing. I've got a magenta card base, just an 8.5 by 11 cut, scored, folded in half, and a piece of deep teal cardstock that's 5 1/4 by 4. I've gone ahead and placed the 2 flowers and the words on the lid of my stamping platform, and I'm going to place my teal cardstock and lay it down with the magnets. I've inked up my stamps with Versamark ink. I'm going to close the lid, press down really well, and if I feel like I don't have a very good impression, I can ink that up again. And there are a couple little spots that need a little bit of re-inking, so I'm going to ink and stamp one more time. And I'm happy with the way that looks, so I'm going to take that out of my stamp positioner. I'm going to take my stamp chamois from Lawn Fawn and I'm going to clean off those stamps. I have some gold detail embossing powder and I've pulled over my embossing tray, and I'm going to pour that powder over top and tap off the excess. And I've got my heat gun, and now I'm going to melt my gold embossing powder. To color in on this dark cardstock, I'm going to be using Prismacolor pencils. I'm going to start off by coloring in all of my images in with white. What that does is give a white base for the other colored pencils to go over top, and they show up much more boldly and vividly. So you want to make sure that your colored pencils are good and sharp so you can get inside all those little embossing sections and just fill everything in first with the white colored pencil. Now that I've colored everything in with the white, I'm going to go in with the colored pencils over top. I'm using lime green, and I'm going to color right over that white. And it'll really help that color stand out and be more bold and vivid. Moving on to the flowers, I'm using rouge, and I'm going to add this darker color at the bottom of some of the petals, with a little bit of it moving up into the petal. So wherever you'd like it to be darker, just add that darker shade of pencil. So now each of these petals has a little bit of that rouge. I'm going to do the same thing on this smaller flower. Next, I'm going to go in with rose pink, and I'm going to color every place else that is left white on the petals up above that darker shade. And you can go down into the darker shade a little bit and blend it in, but you don't want to overcolor too much. I'm going to do the same thing on this smaller flower. And then I'm going to go back to the white, and just on the top tip of these petals, I'm going to go in and add a little bit more white just to give it that really nice shading and shadowing and definition. And the really nice thing about these colored pencils is you can go back in and layer and blend. If you're not happy with anything, you can just keep adding more color. So here's those flowers finished coloring in. I think that's just a really quick and easy way to get a really pretty, elegant look. And I've added tape runner to the back of the card. I'm going to center that on my card panel. And I feel like there was a little bit more white space than I wanted that just kind of needed to be filled in a little bit more. So I'm taking some really small glue dots and scattering them around on my card. And I have a packet of small gold gems. And on each of those glue dots, I'm going to place a little gem. And with those gems in place, here's our first finished card. So now we're ready to move on to our second card. And for that card, I have a green cardstock base, just an 8.5 by 11 cut, scored, folded in half. I've got a pale piece of cardstock cut to 3.5 by 4 3/4, and 110 pound weight white cardstock that's been cut to 3 1/4 by 4.5. I've placed that white cardstock in my stamp positioner. I've also placed the stamps where I would like them, and I'm inking them up with black memento ink. And I've stamped that out a couple of times to get a good impression. For this card, I'm going to be doing a little masking. So I've stamped just the top section of the flower and cut that away without the stem. I've used black StazOn and stamped it on a piece of masking magic paper, and I've cut it out right along the lines. We're going to set that aside for right now. I'm coloring in my flower with tri-blend markers from Spectrum Noir. These are alcohol-based markers that have 3 shades of the same color in the marker for really easy blending. I'm taking the yellow-green blend and filling in the stem and the leaves with the lightest shade. Then I'm going to go in with the darker shade of the same marker, add just a little bit of shadow, and then go in with the medium tone. I kind of blend those in together. I wanted to keep the coloring really simple on this. For the flower, I'm using Fair Skin Blend, and I'm going to color in the flower completely with the lightest shade. Then I'm going to go in with the darkest shade and add shadow to the bottom of all of these petals, just kind of in a little bit of a half moon oval direction. And then going in with the medium tone in between the lightest and the darkest shade. I'm just going to kind of blend those two together. And then I'm just going to leave it. I'm not going to do any more additional blending. This is such a pale color. I definitely wanted you to be able to see the difference in the tones. I've peeled off the backing paper from the mask, and I'm going to place that over top of the flower. Make sure that's pressed down well. I've got peeled paint Distress Oxide ink and a blending brush. I'm going to pick up some ink on that brush, and I want to make sure that I'm wiping a little bit of that off. I don't want a really heavy coat. I'm going to start on the mask in the center of the flower and begin to swirl that ink outward so that it's a little bit heavier in the center and lighter going out. And then I'm going to go down the stem. I didn't mask the stem off because the greens aren't really going to compete with each other very much. Just keep adding that ink until I'm happy with the results. And next I'm going to carefully peel up that mask. I now have that nice, pretty haloed image. And don't forget that you can wipe off your masks, put them back on the masking paper, and save them and use them again later. To finish off my card, I've adhered the white to the pink cardstock. I'm going to place that in the center of my card. And here's our second finished card. And now we're ready to move on to our third card. This is with the ink smooshing technique. And for that, I have a piece of pale pink basil cardstock for the base. It's just been 8.5 by 11 cut, scored, folded in half. And a piece of Strathmore watercolor paper that's been cut to 5 1/4 by 4. I placed that watercolor paper back in my stamp positioning tool, and I've placed one of the flowers and the "You're the Best" and "Friend" words on, and I've stamped them out with StazOn black ink. I've cleaned off my stamps, and I'm going to use the same flower and just place it in a slightly different position. Pick that up with the lid and stamp it. And then I'm going to stamp it a third time in the upper right hand corner as well. And here's my finished stamped panel. I'm ready to add my ink. I've brought over my craft mat. Any slick surface will work, like if you have an acetate mat or a glass mat, anything that's non-porous. You're going to want to use dye-based inks for this technique. I've got 3 different colors of ink pads from Stampin' Up. I've got Blushing Bride, Pear Pizzazz, and So Saffron. And I also have the little sheet of acetate that is the backing for the actual stamp set. I'm going to take my ink pads and I'm going to rub them on my craft mat so that it picks up some of that color. So I've rubbed all 3 colors on my craft mat. I've got a spray bottle that's filled with water, and I'm going to spritz those inks down on my craft mat, bring over my stamped panel, and with the acetate, I'm going to pick up some of that water and ink color, and I'm going to tap it onto my watercolor paper. And it's going to transfer these really nice splatters. The more water you have, the runnier it's going to be. I'm moving from the lightest shade to the darkest, so I don't really need to clean off my acetate. I'm just going to pick up that pink. And the same thing, just smush that down onto the watercolor paper, which is why this is called an ink smooshing technique. With the pink and yellow laid down, I'm going to move on to the green. And just move that around and get all those pretty splatters on there. When you're happy with the way your ink smooshing looks, you can let it air dry, or you can go back to your heat tool and set it on low and dry that ink. And to clean off your acetate and your craft mat, you can just take a paper towel and they will wipe clean. With my background ink dry, I want to go back to those Spectrum Noir markers, and using the light shade of the yellow-green blend, I'm going to fill in those stems. And with the lightest shade of the Antique Pink blend, I'm going to completely fill in the flower petals. And that smushing and ink splatter that's on there will show through that inking and add a nice texture. You do want to be aware that using alcohol inks with StazOn ink can cause a little bit of bleeding. So under normal coloring circumstances, I wouldn't do this. But with this background and splatter, you really can't see if it smudges a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and just completely fill in these flowers. I finished coloring in my flowers and I've applied tape runner to the back, and I'm going to place that on my card base. And here's our last finished card. This is all 3 of the cards that we made today. I really like the different techniques. This is a really versatile stamp set. There's a lot of different things that you could do with it. Flowers really work very well for every occasion. On this one, I really love the pop of pink on that darker blue cardstock. The color pencils really pop on there. This is a really soft, sweet look with the ink blending around and the masking technique. And I think this ink smooshing splatter technique is a really fun, loose watercolor way to get a really impactful card. I hope you've enjoyed these tutorials today. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Be sure to check out my channel and subscribe. And I hope you have a really wonderful day. Bye!